There is one show that had caught my attention, a show that could be considered lost in time. The live-action Astroboy, or originally called Mighty Atom. It is a show that was produced by Matsuzaki Productions and Mainichi Broadcasting System, and was aired on Fuji TV from the 7th of March 1959 to the 28th of May 1960. The show is a piece of media that definitely reflects on the technology of the special effects of its time, which is quite limited and not something that people today should really expect too much out of. The story was also something that really disappointed me, mostly because it was completely different to what the original source material was, and the design of his suit looked pretty goofy. Rather than following the original story of Astro Boy being created to replace Tobio, the deceased son of Dr. Tenma, this story instead has him be created to fight against an evil organization that seeks world domination. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Astro Boy, and I haven't seen the original story or read the original manga, but from what I have read about the history of Astro Boy and the intention that was developed, I can understand the basic premise that Astro Boy was supposed to represent in the manga and the first anime. From the creator of Astro Boy himself, he states that if you read Astro Boy carefully, you will understand that the theme of the story is how science and technology, including robotics, can negatively affect humanity. Meanwhile, the live-action show just has Astro Boy be a character who is a hero of justice and fights against bad guys, which downplays the morals of what Astro Boy was intended to be, and instead substitutes it with a simple story of a heroic boy fighting for justice. This is just only one example of themes and plot points differing from the original manga. For more examples, Dr. Tenma was apparently deceased in the storyline, and he leaves behind a hopeful message which makes Astro Boy fight for Dr. Tenma's beliefs. Another example is this random introduction of this family being something who is important to the story, and another example is when Dr. Ochanomizu reminds Astro Boy that he should avoid trouble because he was programmed by Dr. Tenma to never harm humans. But even with this reminder, Astro Boy for some reason still beats up humans. However, I guess the humans he beats up are the bad humans, so I guess the reasoning can be justifiable. Now, there is one big problem with my analysis of this show, and it's that there are only 5 episodes available on the internet that is subbed in English, which means that I am only able to judge the whole show based on the 5 episodes available. It also means that I could have biases of this show, where I was not able to get an idea on what the whole show is like. There could potentially be more character growth and potential shift in story writing, because surprisingly, the first 5 episodes that are available in English subs are serialized, meaning it's a continuing story and not episodic. So my opinion and review on this show isn't really complete, because I would most preferably like to watch the entire show before making an opinion. But since only 5 episodes are available online, I can only base my opinion on the 5 episodes. But there is good news and there is bad news. The good news is that this show is actually available to purchase online in stores that may have potential stock, and even better, they apparently have English subtitles. The bad news is that some sources say that specific episodes have gone missing, and that those episodes may not be recoverable, but other sources do say that it still includes all 65 episodes of the show in the DVD boxes, so I'm not sure what to believe, regardless on whether this is available or not. The morals of the 5 episodes that I have seen is vastly different from what the source material was, which leads to conflicting beliefs from none other than the creator of Astro Boy, or Mighty Atom, in where he views the live action as something that is considered his allergy, and that person is none other than Osamu Tezuka himself, the god of manga. Osamu Tezuka was born on the 3rd of November 1928 and passed away on the 9th of February 1989. He was born in Toyonaka, Osaka, but grew up in Takarazuka. In my opinion, Tezuka had a pretty good upbringing. Born into a family who were well off. His mother came from a military family, and his father was a son of a lawyer. He would have parents who would give him exposure to mangas, Disney cartoons, and international movies, and had teachers who would give him motivations to pursue his dreams. They would be the people who would give him inspiration and courage to pursue manga and animation later in his career. 2 examples of people who inspired him are his own mum and teachers. While Tezuka was stuck between the decision to either focus on becoming a doctor or a manga artist. His own mum would be the one to motivate him to follow his true passions, as Tezuka's true passions was to become a manga artist. He thought of being a doctor in medicine would be an alternative, as society didn't look down on doctors, and a few generations ago he had ancestors who were doctors. But Tezuka himself admits that he didn't enjoy being a doctor, and with the motivation from his own mum, he would make the decision to dedicate his life to manga. However, this decision still didn't set him back from still being able to become a licensed doctor in medicine, even with his gruesome schedule during the days of his manga magazine career. His teachers are another example. During the time of Japan's priority in military education during the Second World War, his teacher would motivate him to never give up on his dreams and to pursue manga after the war, as his teachers saw that he had talent in drawing and wanted young Tezuka to be able to maximize his talents. These are two of the most influential people in Tezuka's early life. The downsides of his upbringing was the bullying during his youth when he was growing up, the sudden change in Japanese education becoming militaristic, and the conflict of experiencing the Second World War. During these gruesome times, Tezuka would witness the importance that life brings to people, since he had witnessed a lot of death during the Osaka air raids, and later, after the war, while studying to become a doctor, he would witness the death of patients firsthand. These experiences would form the basis of what his philosophy of life would be. Going back to the beginning of Tezuka's love for manga, Tezuka started drawing manga while he was very young, and would love to tell his stories through the manga he created, which impressed one of his teachers during his school years. He was also very competitive in creating manga, especially during the highs of his career. According to his sister, when there was competition between him and his siblings when drawing manga, Tezuka was said to have doodled all over the manga that my middle brother had worked so hard to draw, making it look messy. As his love for manga continues, during the Second World War, when he was a watchman in Osaka, he would still draw manga secretly. One example was drawing manga on toilet paper for others to read, and hiding his manga drawings to avoid getting found out by his superiors. During this time, he regards it as one of his tragic moments in his life, especially during the Osaka air raids, witnessing the incendiary bombs being dropped from above and seeing dead and charred bodies in the aftermath of the air raid, as well as after Japan's surrender, seeing dead bodies of people dying from starvation and wondering if this was going to be the future of Japan. These events, and also during his encounter with American GIs, where Tezuka was beat up for no apparent reason, would also give him a philosophy that reflects onto the manga he makes later in his career. Because of these experiences, for most of his stories, it is usually based around life and death and the consequences of human advancements. Astroboy was one example about the problems with human and nuclear advancements, where Tezuka is anti-war and the theme of destruction that human advancements can make, such as producing power nuclear weapons or creating invincible robots, is a problem that Tezuka wants to emphasize with Astroboy. In the initial manga, before Mighty Atom, in the final chapter of Ambassador Atom, Astroboy's first appearance, Astroboy is seen ripping his head off and offering his head to an alien civilization. This was supposed to be a way for Astroboy to show the aliens that humanity comes in peace on his behalf, as there was a risk of a war that would take place between aliens and humans, and also in the anime shows Astroboy taking a nuclear bomb into the sun, so that it is a self-sacrifice to save the earth on his behalf. Other famous manga examples about life and death written and created by Tezuka include Blackjack and Phoenix, where the story of Blackjack was about an undercover doctor who was extremely skilled at treating patients. According to Tezuka, the doctor eventually questions himself on whether it was something that he wanted to do. As Tezuka describes, if there are many doctors with advanced technology or genius skills, then by helping humans, aren't they actually putting them in a difficult position? This is the problem of population growth. With population growth comes various problems such as environmental destruction and food crisis. In Phoenix, it is a story that is about the concept of life as described by Tezuka. The phoenix that appears in this work is not a bird, but a symbol of life, as there are characters in the story who wanted to pursue immortality as they didn't want to die, and they are attached to these desires as they want to be young forever. In summary, many events of his childhood and adolescent years would help to develop his philosophy. He would also adapt his philosophy into many other animes and mangas, a message of wanting to give the viewer or reader the understanding what life gives to people and how much we should cherish it. As Tezuka says himself, no matter how omnipotent science becomes, it would be a huge mistake for humans to think they can become like God. They are still just foolish creatures. So, isn't it okay to think of humans as being on the same level as other animals and plants? If we are creatures on the same level, then humans should at least find a job that is worth living while they are alive, and then when the time comes to die, they should die satisfied. That is what life is all about, and this is what I draw in my manga, changing themes from time to time. As we now know, according to Tezuka himself, the theme of Astroboy is how science and technology, including robotics, can negatively affect humanity. Prior to the philosophy of the theme of Astroboy, in the very first appearances, Astroboy was known to be more of an ambassador. From here onwards, we will call Astroboy using the original names, which was first Ambassador Atom and then Mighty Atom. It all began with Ambassador Atom. It ran between April 1951 to March 1952 and was published by Cumbia for Monthly Shonen Boys magazine. The most infamous character, Atom, is only a side character in the story. According to Frederick L. Schott, the story can be painful to read, even though the main premise of the story was about the conflict of miscommunication between humans and aliens, where aliens who came from an identical Earth had come to the current Earth to settle after their home Earth was blown up. Although at peace at first, eventually problems begin to arise, especially with competing for food and other societal discrepancies. How Atom comes into the story is similar to how the next Atom series is made, where Atom was created by Dr. Tenma to replicate his deceased son, who died in a crash, and Atom was raised like a normal human child until Dr. Tenma realizes that Atom couldn't grow up like the other human children. The difference from here onwards is that in Ambassador Atom, Dr. Tenma became the cause of a close destruction of the Earth, where he becomes deranged and creates a secret liquid weapon and uses it against the aliens. The aliens then threaten to destroy Earth with a hydrogen bomb as revenge, and Atom rebels from his father to stop the chaos, where he visits the aliens as an emissary of peace and proposes alternative ways to live peacefully and leaves his head behind as a gesture of sincerity. However, Ambassador Atom didn't live up to the expectation of becoming a hit series. It was only until a meeting with the editor-in-chief of Shonen magazine, Takeshi Kanai, who would propose to Tezuka to make Atom the main character of a new series. The idea would be to make Atom be more human-like, while still keeping the idea of a humanoid robot, as this would be seen as a way that could be more relatable to the readers and also giving the character a sense of justice so that it could be seen as an appealing hero. According to Kanai, depicted in the Osamu Tezuka story, A Life in Manga, he says, to the readers, Atom can be a boy, just like them. You can give him a warm heart like a human, have him laugh and cry, even get angry. With this idea, Tezuka would then create one of the most iconic IPs in Japan. Ambassador Atom was then recreated as Mighty Atom, which was published by Cumbia for Monthly Shonen and had a long run of 17 years, starting from April 1952 to March 1968. Mighty Atom had a similar backstory to the original Ambassador Atom, but the difference with Mighty Atom is that Atom gets sold into a circus and is forced to fight other robots like him as a form of entertainment. From here, he gets bought by Dr. Ochanomizu and is rescued from the circus. According to Frederick L. Schott, the Mighty Atom series has a wide variety of storylines that ranges in where Tezuka had to incorporate subjects that interested him personally in order to keep himself from being bored. And according to the Osamu Tezuka story, the story writing for Mighty Atom was considered to be more of a situational drama with multiple stories, regardless of the stories that were told and the way it was written. Mighty Atom would go on to become extremely popular, becoming a cultural icon that still has its influences today. Eventually, this popularity for Mighty Atom would be adapted into animation, which is a lifelong dream for Tezuka, who apparently watched Disney cartoons like Bambi over 80 times. Making animation had been a lifelong dream for Tezuka. In his childhood, he had been influenced by a lot of Disney cartoons, as well as other animations from overseas and even animations in Japan. To make things clear, Tezuka wasn't the first person to create manga or animation in Japan. There have been many artists that predate Tezuka who had established a name for themselves, but what makes Tezuka be the first in this entertainment medium? It was the creation of the first ever anime TV show in Japan, Mighty Atom, the anime. Tezuka had gotten married in 1959, became a licensed doctor, and started his own company called Mushi Productions, and where he was able to create animation. And prior to the airing of Mighty Atom, Tezuka and the staff who made the anime adaptation had come across a lot of hardships and uncertainty. The major thing that burdened Tezuka and the staff was that no one in Japan had ever attempted to make a weekly 24 to 30 minute animation show. In those days, it required a large amount of staff to make animation, and making animation was time consuming. A lot of animation in those days required artists to hand draw a still image, and for each second for smooth animation required a lot of frames. Prior to this, Tezuka at the time also had almost no knowledge on how to begin to create animation, so he asked a friend of his who was Ushio Soji to accompany him to visit Ashida Productions, a company where Tezuka was turned down from joining when Tezuka started out as a manga artist. And this time, Tezuka wanting to ask for advice was also turned down again, where he was told, "It's not worth it for someone like you who can make a living from manga, so it's better if you don't come into this world." However, Tezuka did get exposure to animation during the adaptation of Son Goku the Monkey from Toei Animation. As Tezuka was a consultant for the making of the adaptation, he was still able to get exposure to the animated making of the adaptation. With these experiences, Tezuka was determined to make animation, but the problem of being the first to create a weekly animated TV series was still a major problem. So in order for the adaptation of Mighty Atom to work, Tezuka first managed to lower the production cost to appeal to the sponsors to convince the sponsors that it was affordable to make, and second, he would limit the number of frames per second and simplify the animation where it wouldn't flow as well as Disney cartoons. So it was a compromise, but even though Tezuka had made a lot of compromises, he and his staff still underwent a lot of struggle to produce the first episode. Tezuka wasn't always available to guide the staff and direct the animation, as Tezuka was still under deadlines to make manga for many magazine companies, so sometimes the staff had to wait for Tezuka to show up before knowing what Tezuka had envisioned. Eventually, the staff do take control, but in the early stages, the staff were dependent on Tezuka for direction. After all the stress and the many all-nighters pulled off from the staff, Japan's first domestically produced weekly anime was shown. The first airing was on 1st of January 1963, and the final airing was on 31st of December 1966. Mighty Atom became a cultural phenomenon. The first domestically produced TV anime in Japan would go on to have an influence on the rest of the world. Mighty Atom was also renamed as Astroboy when it was dubbed for the US audience. With the success of Astroboy, Tezuka's dream of making his own animation would be a dream come true. Now, there was no happy ending after the success of Astroboy, as later in the years, Mushi Productions would go bankrupt and Tezuka would leave his own company, and deadlines for magazines would stalk him everywhere he went, even during trips to the USA. However, many awards were won, and the storylines for Tezuka's works was captivating audiences, so there were moments of sadness and moments of greatness that continued throughout his lifetime. But I now want to go back to 1959, when the live-action adaptation was airing. After learning more about Tezuka's philosophy and passions, we can understand some reasonings on why Tezuka disliked live-action adaptations for a long time. The live action of Mighty Atom had interested me at first, mostly because I wanted to learn more about the reasons why the show was made and what Tezuka had thought about the show, and if he had any input in helping to produce it. And after watching the available 5 episodes that are English subbed, I can see why the live action show isn't really favored. For my summarized review, the 5 episodes I have seen do not come close to representing the source material. Atom is more of a heroic character who saves the day, rather than a story that focuses on robots coexisting with humanity and the goofy outfits aren't very appealing. To be honest, I almost laughed in the opening scene where they showed the animation and then they showed the live action character. I mean, I don't disrespect the actor in any way, but this suit looks goofy. Then we have the focus on this family, which I feel like they don't really serve a purpose, other than get kidnapped and force Atom out to come save them. To put it bluntly, I didn't expect it to be the way it is. Let's just say I can understand why Tezuka became allergic to live action. Now there's very limited information about the making of this adaptation. Although there are websites online from Japanese sources, they mostly describe the episodes, the story changes, the impact of the show, and obviously some complaints about it. But from what I could find of this show, from my understanding, there doesn't seem to be any particular reason as to why the show was made. So some assumptions are to be had, unless someone out there is able to find any information regarding why this adaptation came to be. Although there is one citation from a researcher who had claimed that there were discussions of making a short theatrical Astroboy film, or perhaps a TV series, or a possibility of a story read out over still images with minimal zooms and pans. However, these ideas were still dropped, and a live action adaptation ended up being the favored option, as TV animation didn't seem possible at the time. But surprisingly enough, there was a puppet show that was made prior to the adaptation. But other than these options, I didn't feel like there was still a valid reason as to why the live action was made, other than discussions for making it. There didn't seem to be a clear motive, like wanting to make the show because the manga was popular. So other than these claims, I couldn't find any other motives. But to look into what I can find, it all started with Matsusaki Keiji, or real name is Yoshihisa Aoki. He was born in Kyoto Prefecture and studied in the Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. According to Ushio Soji, or real name Tomio Sagisu, a good friend of Tezuka, in his biography called Tezuka, Osamu and Me, Matsuzaki was also an heir of the hospital. However, I'm not sure how accurate this translation is, as the original book is written in Japanese and I had to use Google Translate to translate the entire book to find this information. And looking at some translating errors, I'm not sure if the grammatical errors make sense, as in this chapter it first explains Matsuzaki's position as being the head of Toho's cultural film department, then it immediately skips to some information and begins mentioning about a hospital that was named after Matsuzaki. But I guess it coincides with another source that I found, in where Matsuzaki was a student in medicine, and also how he was a Soviet translator, which also has some common link with Ushio Soji mentioning that Matsuzaki was a Marxist boy. Regardless, after the end of the war and the end of the Toho dispute, which saw many staff from Toho leaving the company, which includes Ushio and Matsuzaki, Matsuzaki would go on to create his own production company. His famous works, from what I can understand, is the live action adaptations of Mighty Atom and Tetsujin 28. Also, Eiji Tsuburaya, who was also a good friend of Matsuzaki as well as Ushio, was brought in by Matsuzaki to be the head of the special effects for the adaptation of Mighty Atom. However, Tsuburaya's special effects team ended up being in charge of the special effects, and Tsuburaya became the supervisor. Now there's an interesting story that was in an article that featured Tsuburaya's opinion and thoughts of Mighty Atom. Using Google Translate, which didn't provide the best results, there is still a message that Tsuburaya has made, and it's that Tsuburaya understood the context of Mighty Atom, with two translations giving a similar idea that the acting by the actors would not only take away the cuteness of the first Astroboy, but would also make it seem more realistic, and the fun of the eccentric dream would be diluted. Tsuburaya was also impressed with Tezuka's work in the original manga, saying, "The first thing that impressed me when I read Astroboy was how well it was drawn. I felt that if they made a movie based on that, it would definitely be able to rival a Disney movie." But the most interesting thing about this is that since Eiji Tsuburaya was asked to help with the special effects for the live action adaptation, he understood the context of the original manga to the point where he declined the offer. However, according to one source, it says that it is imagined that it is not the Astroboy from the TV series, but something different, and it is possible that it is a live action Astroboy planned by Daiei Films in the early 1950s. However, Eiji Tsuburaya still participated in the making of the 1959 live action Mighty Atom, but was apparently a supervisor and not the head of the special effects of the show. And the main team that did the special effects was done by the Tsuburaya Special Effects Research Institute, rather than solely Tsuburaya himself. As far as I'm aware, this is as much information that I can gather about the making of the live action Mighty Atom. The next interesting thing to talk about is the reception of this show. From one source, it provides us a positive outlook of the show, showing us a stage show of Mighty Atom fighting a robot that looks like the live action version of Tetsujin 28, with apparently many children who were present at the stage show, which means that there was popularity for the show, and the audience of children tuning in proved that the live action left an impact on the audience. Also, there seemed to be a rise in television viewership. From the same source, the show started at a penetration rate of 23.6% and saw a rise of viewership when the show ending at a penetration rate of 44.7%, so just over 1 year. The live action Mighty Atom had grown in popularity. However, I am a bit skeptical of this. At the time, TV ownership in Japan was still low. According to the same source, the average price of a TV in those days was 175,000 yen. When adjusted for inflation, it would be about 1.1 million yen, or roughly $7,500, meaning that at the beginning of the introduction of TVs, not many people could afford it until the purchasing power of individual households became greater. As this period was an economic boom for Japan, more and more people would be able to afford TV. For my reasoning, the growing penetration rate isn't because of the popularity of the live action show, but rather the fact that more Japanese citizens could afford to purchase TV, and not really because they wanted to watch the live action show. However, I do not have any evidence for this, as this is just a theory that I have. But despite the growth in the supposed popularity of the show, there is also still some dislikes of the show. The common complaints from viewers that I could find were that it's a disappointment. There were some complaints on poor quality and how much it didn't look like the original, especially how the characters feel disconnected from the original, with one mentioning that the Doctor's nose wasn't bigger and that the face of the actor looked nothing like Atom, while another source criticizes details that don't match the original, such as, "My arms have the power of 1000 horsepower. What? Aren't they 100,000 horsepower?" And even mentioning the opening episode, how there were 2 assassinations in what looks like a bar, with one happening in Paris and one happening in Madrid. The blogger of these complaints would go on to suggest that the setting for the 2 locations was the same, and concluding that, is it a chain of izakaya restaurants with stores in Paris and Madrid or something? But what's probably the most interesting is the thoughts from Tezuka himself. Now, there isn't really much information about what Tezuka's thoughts on the live action show was, but from what I can find, it is still negative. The first source is from Ushio Soji. In one story about his biography about Tezuka, it was about Ushio getting permission to produce a live action adaptation of Ambassador Magma, a manga story created by Tezuka. At first, when Ushio brings up the idea of making the adaptation, Tezuka ignores the idea of a live action and granted permission to adapt an anime. However, Ushio had to make it clear with Tezuka, and from here Ushio writes, "As soon as I said that, his face changed color." Tezuka disliked this idea and replied, "Ushio, I don't want to see a live action version. If you make a live action version, I won't give my permission." This then comes with a description from Ushio noting, "His face was bright red and he glared at me." However, Ushio understood the situation and the reason why Tezuka disliked live action adaptations, as Ushio himself notes about the live action Astroboy, saying, "I don't want to be acquainted with that production method. I wondered why Tezuka had allowed such a terrible TV adaptation." Eventually, Tezuka agrees and grants permission for Ambassador Magma to be made into live action. But at the moment when Tezuka agreed, Ushio notes, "At that moment tears start to flow and Tezuka Osamu's face looked distorted." From the second source, which was much later in Tezuka's career, during the increase of popularity of Astro Boy in the US around the 1960s to 1980s, Tezuka would go on to promote his anime in the USA. Around this time, when he made trips to America, he would eventually meet Walt Disney and many of the American fans. In one article titled Osamu Tezuka, A Memorial to the Master, an article compiled in a book made by Fred Patton, there was one special encounter between fans and Tezuka. This encounter was about the fans asking questions about the live-action Mighty Atom. According to the article, this happened in March 1978 and also on December 1978 when Tezuka visited the Cartoon Fantasy organization for a fan Q&A. In the March meeting, when the first question was asked about the live-action, Tezuka replies that it was a false rumor, there had never been such a program. According to the fans, it had puzzled them due to the live-action Mighty Atom being listed in Japanese TV monster and hero dictionaries. And again, when Tezuka returns in December, the fans had brought copies of the dictionaries with photos of the live-action Astro Boy. Tezuka then proceeded to give an answer saying, "Well, yes, but it was so bad. Please don't tell the American people about it." So, it was obvious that Tezuka had negative thoughts about the live-action Mighty Atom. At this point, there shouldn't be any secret to hide. A lot of Tezuka's works have a meaning to the story. A lot of it is based on his philosophy of life, where humans should at least find a job that is worth living while they are alive, and then when the time comes to die, they should die satisfied, which is a consistent theme about life that Tezuka envisions in his mangas and animes. Tezuka values the importance of providing a meaningful story, and if there was anything out there that would change the way his works would be envisioned, then it will be something that could be considered as disrespectful to the real message of the story. Regardless, the live action Mighty Atom doesn't look great. I don't know why they decide to make it, and Tezuka extremely is allergic to it, so yeah. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I am aware that there are some points that I have missed out on, but since this video is already longer than I want it to be, I have decided to leave it out. If you would like to learn more about Tezuka and others, feel free to click on the links below from what I could find about Tezuka's life and work, and if you want to learn even more, then I suggest to buy a book about Tezuka, which will most likely be in Japanese. But that's it. That's the video. So yeah.